Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. Can everybody hear me okay? Do you need me to use the microphone? Okay, I will.
You can take it out of paragraph if you want.
Okay, sure. This works? Okay, very good. So, what I want to talk about today is what I see as the key fissures that exist within both political parties in the contemporary United States. Because, as Chris said, both parties are internally divided right now. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties are engaged in a real battle for what they want to represent, what their core identity is, what their soul will be. And in fact, that's not melodramatic. The members of the parties themselves talk about those kinds of existential questions about their party's identity. They talk about battles for the soul of their own party. But I think it's important to look in each case about what exactly that means. That is, what are the contesting visions of what the Republican Party should stand for, what the Democratic Party should stand for? And I'll talk a little bit about both of those. I think it's important to begin with a reminder that the indispensable mission of any political party is to win elections. It's not the only goal, but unless you accomplish that, you can't accomplish anything else, right? So you can have the most beautiful, pure, well-articulated, intellectually and morally sound platform imaginable. If you don't win elections, it remains just a beautiful abstraction. It doesn't get put into power. The reason that political parties form in the first place is as vehicles for gaining and using political power. So we have to keep in mind then, as we think about where both political parties stand in America today, both questions about what they want to be, but at the same time, what the electorate will allow them to be. Right? Because there has to be a compromise between those two things. That is, each political party has to ask itself, not only what is it that we want to be, but how close can we approximate what we want to be and still plausibly win a national election in the United States? So there are both more abstract ideological considerations as well as practical considerations that are at play. And the interplay between those two really shapes the menu for choice that political parties have. So let's talk first of all about the Republican Party, because that's the one whose internal turmoil is most obvious. And of course, obviously, when Donald Trump became the Republican nominee in 2016, that was a real shock to the system of the Republican Party. Very few people saw that coming. It was certainly not a development that most power brokers and gatekeepers in the Republican Party would have welcomed. They did not welcome it. They did not anticipate it. But Trump's candidacy and the appeal that Trump had highlighted some problems that the Republican establishment had been ignoring and trying to sweep under the rug for a long time. And Trump's candidacy, for good or for ill, brought those to the fore in a way where they simply could not be ignored anymore. That doesn't mean that easy answers to those challenges present themselves, but he certainly foregrounded certain problems that I'll talk about. One thing that's important to keep in mind here, and Trump's candidacy certainly serves as a reminder of this, is that the United States is very unusual among democracies around the world in that we allow ordinary rank and file voters to choose our party's candidates. That's not the norm in democracies around the world. Overwhelmingly, the pattern is that political parties choose their own candidates. They put forward their nominees for parliament, for the presidency, for whatever the office may be, and then voters can choose between the people that the various parties have put forward. But in a sense, our political culture is hyper-democratic, right? In the sense that not only do people get to choose between the Democratic nominees and the Republican nominees, they get to choose the Democratic and Republican nominees from whom they will ultimately choose. So there is a level of popular involvement and a level of mass-based political choice that informs what happens in our system that really doesn't apply in most countries around the world. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. That certainly manifested itself in the 2016 Republican primaries. because quite clearly Donald Trump was not the choice of the power brokers within the Republican Party, and yet he emerged as the nominee because of that level of mass public involvement in the process, including, and this is an even more remarkable feature of the system, including involvement by a lot of people in a lot of states who aren't even registered Republicans. Right? Some states have closed primaries where you have to be a member of the party to vote in the primary, but a lot of states, including Texas, say anybody can show up, right? Any person in Texas, if you're a registered voter, you can show up, you can vote in the Democratic primary, or you can vote in the Republican primary. You're not registered as a member of any party. It's your choice. Any registered voter in Texas can show up and vote in the Republican or the Democratic primary. So that just highlights the level of mass involvement in the process that really is a unique feature of our system. Okay, so then what were these elements that Trump highlighted within the party that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy? So traditionally, Republican candidates who have been successful have united three core constituencies, both demographically and ideologically. Successful Republican candidates have brought together economic conservatives who believed in free markets, low taxes, minimal regulation, small welfare state, etc. That's one core pillar of traditional Republican belief. They also had to bring in social and moral conservatives, people who believed in conserving the traditional values of American society, people who, generally speaking, were religiously observant, tended to be pro-life, support traditional family norms, who also, along with that, tended to be highly patriotic, respect the flag, value both secular and religious dimensions of what we might call traditional American values. There's a lot there to unpack, but we'll leave it at that for now. That's the social conservative pillar. And then the third group that was part of that was the conservative foreign policy establishment, those who really believed in strong national defense, support for a powerful U.S. military, so relatively high defense spending, and who were also typically supportive of using American military power around the world to advance American interests and American influence in various ways. People who have typically been traditionally been classified as hawks when it comes to foreign policy. That was the coalition that propelled Ronald Reagan to landslide majorities in 1980 and 1984. Fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, and national defense hawks. It was the coalition that George W. Bush was able largely to reassemble, although it's perhaps telling that for George W. Bush, it didn't produce the overwhelming victories it produced for Reagan. It produced narrow victories, but victories nonetheless, right, bringing those three elements together again. Donald Trump is in many ways, an odd choice and an odd candidate for all three of those groups. For the economic conservatives, he clearly is not a true believer. And what I mean is, he's far more willing to embrace trade tariffs and restrictionist international trade policy than the conservative economic establishment would be. Okay? Certain elements of Trump's economic policy horrify the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Because the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal believes in the orthodoxy of free movement of capital and labor, so relatively liberal immigration policies, very much free trade policies, no tariffs, minimal immigration restrictions, as I say, free movement of capital and labor, also low taxes and low regulation, where he has delivered. Right? But the other pillar of that orthodoxy traditionally was a strong belief in the necessity of entitlement reform. Right? For the long-term health of the United States, we've got to get the deficit under control. We've got to spend less on Medicare. We've got to spend less in terms of Social Security. We've got to control the growth of costs within those programs for the United States to be on a long-term sustainable fiscal trajectory. You will never hear Donald Trump say that. Right? Donald Trump pretty much from the get-go explicitly rejected the conventional wisdom within the Republican Party about the necessity of entitlement reform. He's not interested in entitlement reform. So he's unorthodox in that respect. So for the economic conservatives, some things to like, some things not so much. For the social conservatives, this is a particularly interesting case because if you just look at Donald Trump as an individual, he would seem to be a terrible choice from their standpoint, right? I mean, this is a guy who really was the first person to put a strip club in his casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All right. This is a person who has bragged publicly about infidelity to his wife, about the number of other men's wives with whom he slept, right? Just made no pretense about it. So he is not a person to whom you would think social conservatives, moral conservatives, would naturally gravitate. Moreover, in the past, he held very much, pro-choice views with regard to abortion, things like that. But in running in 2016, he left all that behind, at least from a policy standpoint, and he told social conservatives, if you elect me, I will give you what you want. I will be, whatever I believed in the past, I will be a champion for the things that you most care about. And here's the remarkable thing, especially for a politician. He's actually telling the truth. I mean, when it comes to that, when it comes to those kinds of issues, he actually has done what he said he would do in terms of nominating judges that social conservatives prefer, in terms of advancing a socially conservative agenda in a variety of ways in the White House through executive orders, et cetera. And then on the more secular social conservative side, when we look at the whole, patriotism, American flag, et cetera, I mean, Trump has pushed that more aggressively than pretty much any president you can imagine. In terms of secular social conservatism, he's as strong as you get. All right, then you go to the foreign policy side. And Trump does believe in a strong military, right? And he has supported enhanced defense spending. However, he's been quite reticent about the use of American military power around the world, much more so than previous presidents of both parties. He's been highly reluctant to engage the American military abroad. Now, a lot of voters like that, but it certainly is a departure from the traditional hawkish posture of national defense conservatives that were part of that Republican coalition. So then, in advancing Donald Trump as its candidate, the Republican Party had to kind of rethink what was that traditional relationship between those three elements of its core appeal: the economic appeal, the social cultural appeal, and the foreign policy appeal. And as we know, the divisions within the Republican Party over these sorts of questions have not healed. Right? There remains very much a battle within the Republican Party about whether the party will be remade in a more nationalist, populist, statist, in some ways, Trumpian image, or whether after Trump departs the scene, it kind of reverts to the status quo ante, and we're back to, free market economics, a fair amount of social conservatism, and a relatively hawkish foreign policy. We'll see. I mean, the big question for the Republicans is Trump just a bizarre interlude after which we go back to the status quo ante? Or does he signal this is a new future? This is what the party is now. And we'll circle back at the end to talk about what the consequences of that answer might be. So the Republicans are grappling with whether they are going to be the traditional free market internationalist party that they had been, or whether they're going to be a more populist nationalist party. All right, so then let's look at the Democratic side. What are the Democrats wrestling with? Well, now, historically, the Democratic Party in the United States had been a center-left party. And in fact, the criticism from leftists, both in the United States and around the world, is that the Democratic Party in America had been much more center than left. Right? That in fact, it was really didn't have much in common with the avowedly socialist left-leaning parties of Europe, that it was much more accepting of the fundamental structure of the free market capitalist economic order than leftists would like to see, that actually the Democratic Party historically had been, in many cases, just as hawkish as the Republican Party, at least elements of it had with regard to communism. Certainly, John F. Kennedy was noted for being that. There were strong national defense advocates within the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party, at least all the way up through certainly the 1990s under Bill Clinton, trod carefully when it came to social liberalism. They had gotten burned badly in 1972 with George McGovern of having been identified as a candidate of the social and cultural far left, and they recoiled from that to a significant degree. Now, to be clear, Democrats have been overwhelmingly pro-choice for a long time, so they're clearly on the left-hand side of that sort of issue. But, Bill Clinton, who enjoyed great electoral success in the 1990s as a Democratic standard bearer, famously tried to triangulate social cultural issues, wanted to give just enough for people on the social cultural left to find him appealing, but not appear scary or alienating to people on the social and cultural right. So the Democratic Party has a legacy, as I say, in the United States, of being very much a center-left party. Well, there are now, as we all know, loud voices in the Democratic Party who say we don't want to be that anymore. We need to be something different from that want to see the Democratic Party take dramatic strides leftward. On economic policy questions, this takes the form of a relatively forthright embrace of socialism, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders does not shy away from the word. Now, Bernie Sanders is not going to be the Democratic nominee, right? But a large chunk of the Democratic Party wants Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee. Not a majority, but he gave Hillary Clinton a strong run for her money in the 2016 primaries, a guy who self-identifies as a socialist. That tells you something about the leftward drift of the Democratic Party. That's on economic questions. Virtually every Democratic Party candidate, virtually every Democrat running for president right now, wants a universal health care plan more generous, more pervasive, more aggressive than Obamacare. And remember, not too many years ago, Obamacare itself was regarded as quite a big step that was highly controversial. But now everybody running for president on the Democratic side thinks Obamacare is not enough, doesn't go far enough. We need to move further in the direction of universal government health care guarantee. Almost all of them want some form of free college. Okay? Free health care, free college. Almost everybody wants to significantly increase taxes on high-income earners. Elizabeth Warren has even proposed a wealth tax, right? So income tax is not enough, but you'll actually also be taxed if you're, very high wealth, to be clear. But people, really high wealth individuals would be taxed on their accumulated holdings, not only on their income in a given year. I could go on and on. The point is, the center of gravity in terms of economic policy proposals on the Democratic side has moved dramatically leftward for many of the candidates. And so part of the battle they're fighting there is, are we willing to embrace the label of democratic socialists? In Europe, parties of the left do this all the time. Socialism is not a bad word in Europe. It's a political philosophy. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. But there's no stigma associated with it. In the United States, historically, there has been a stigma associated with the word socialist. And it's very clear that on the Democratic side, that's starting to break down. But some Democrats are asking, is this good for the party? Ultimately, is it a good thing that our candidates are so willing to break down this stigma? Right. In terms of cultural politics, I think we have seen over the last several years a dramatic move by Democratic candidates to embrace identity politics, to embrace racial, gender, cultural liberalism, not to triangulate, not to sort of say, well, we want to give a little bit on these questions, but we don't want to alienate, more centrist public opinion. There's a strong push within the party to be an aggressively identity politics party. Right? There are think about this. There are very few candidates running for president on the Democratic side right now who are willing to say, I think monetary reparations for slavery would be a bad idea. I don't think I'd support that. Most of them, so they range essentially from those who say, absolutely, we need to pay monetary reparations for slavery, to those who say, I think that's a very important and interesting question, and I would certainly support a commission to study that. Now, someone who's a little bit cynical knows that the way that you say no to something without really saying no to something is appointing a commission to study that. So, let's grant that that's the case. But the fact that essentially no one is willing to just say, no, that would just be divisive in our country and we can't do that, which is what everyone would have said 15 years ago, it's quite striking about the leftward move in terms of cultural politics in the Democratic Party. In terms of foreign policy, so this is one of the great ironies. As much as Democrats hate Trump, there's actually not a lot of difference necessarily between the parties right now in terms of foreign policy. Trump doesn't want to use American military power abroad. Neither do most of the Democrats. Right? There's not a strong partisan dimension in terms of foreign policy. There are these little idiosyncratic issues where, to be sure, there are differences. Things like who did what with the Ukraine when. But that's not about a broad philosophy of foreign policy. That's more about individual misconduct and allegations of it and that sort of thing. But actually, there are very few. It's hard to imagine a foreign policy issue that would become a central divider of the two parties going forward. That has become less partisan, less ideological than it has often been in the past. So that's an interesting dimension. But the point is, just as the Republicans are having to decide, are we going to be a populist nationalist party or are we going to be a traditional free market conservative party? Democrats are having to decide, are we going to be a cautious center-left party in the image of someone like Bill Clinton, or do we want to definitively reject that and become a forthrightly leftist political movement that seeks to dramatically transform the social and economic order in the United States? That's the tension on the Democratic side. Now, what's interesting is that each party is convinced, and what's fascinating to me is they may or may not be right about this, but each party is convinced that if the insurgents gain the upper hand in the other party, that will spell doom for their opponents and victory for them. What I mean is, Democrats are convinced that if the Trumpian image becomes the Republican Party long term, that the Republican Party is dead. Right? Republicans are convinced that if the leftists take over the Democratic Party, that'll kill the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is dead. So both sides are convinced that the other side would do best to be kind of responsible, establishment, and centrist. The question is, are they right about this? Right? Are they correct in their perceptions of what would be most and least effective for their opponents to adopt? And I think that's very much an open question. Because we have a tendency to assume that what we have seen in the past is safer and more effective than something new. And it is, until it isn't, right? That is, what we've done before is the way to do things until something different breaks through and we have a kind of new political order. What we're going to see very likely, I think, in 2020 is a Trumpian Republican Party because, barring extraordinary developments, Donald Trump's going to be seeking re-election in 2020. So we're going to see a Trumpian populist nationalist Republican Party pitted against, I think, a Democratic nominee who, if I had to bet today, I would say will be Elizabeth Warren, who is significantly to the left of anyone that has been a Democratic nominee in the past. So you'll have Trumpian populist nationalism against leftist, quasi-socialist, at least, identity politics leftism. Each party is convinced that the other guys can't win with that. Somebody's going to be wrong. Okay? Somebody is going to be wrong. And whichever side turns out to be wrong will initiate a bloodbath of recriminations within their own party, right? Because people will say, how messed up did we have to be to lose to that? This is already what the Democrats implicitly are asking themselves, right? I mean, this is why this is part of the reason why there has been such impetus behind the leftist insurgency in the Democratic Party, is because they say Hillary Clinton was the traditional center-left, responsible establishment Democrat, and she lost to that. There's something wrong with the way we've been doing things. If it happens to the Republicans in 2020, if they lose to somebody who is as far left as Elizabeth Warren, they'll say, we're messed up and we got to change things. So anyway, there's a lot we could talk about here, but I want to hear from my colleagues. I'll leave it at that. But hopefully that highlights what I think are some of the core fissures and battles for the identity within both political parties as it will play out in 2020.